Namaste students. This is your social studies teacher. In the previous classes, we discussed the world between wars from 1900 to 1950 part 1. In this class, let us discuss part 2. Today's learning outcomes. Students will come to know how Tsar Nicholas II ruled over his vast empire like any autocrat, and how Tsarist Russia was ruled under the Bolsheviks by the end of the class. Today's agenda: Word of the day, previous knowledge, introduction of Tsarist Russia, Tsarist Nicholas II administration, Bolsheviks administration, recapitulation. Instructions: take a pen and notebook, pause and watch again if clarity is required. Jot down important points in the notebook. Word of the day: abdicate. Verb: to give up the position of being king or queen. Abdication. Noun. Usages: in just 2 days, the situation went so much out of hand that the Tsar abdicated. After abdication of the Tsar, the kingdom collapsed. In the previous classes, we learnt ominous facts, causes of the world wars compared, the special context of the Second World War, consequences of the world wars. Now, let us start discussing the world between wars 1900 to 1950, part 2. Before going to the topic, let me ask you a question. What is the largest country in area in the world? Yes, you are probably right. Answer is Russia. During 1900-1950, Russia was ruled by the Tsars. So, usually it was called Tsarist Russia. Tsarist Russia was spread over two continents and making it a Euro-Asian power. As Russia is in Europe and Asia partly, it is known as Euro-Asian country. It was the third largest populated country in the world after China and India during 1900s and 1950s. Now it is in the ninth place in population in the world. Tsarist Russia comprised several nations like Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Most of the Russians depended on agriculture and got profit from it. The feudal lords owned most of the lands. Feudal lord means a man of rank in the ancient regime. The basic cause of struggle between peasants and feudal lords is control over land. Tsar Nicholas II ruled over his vast Russian empire like any autocrat with the help of the army and bureaucrats. What is meant by autocrat? It means a ruler who has complete power. We can call him even a despot. Russian economy collapsed due to the World War. Before World War I, the Russian army was the largest in the world. By 1917, the Russia lost 2 million soldiers and civilians and became the biggest loser of human lives in the World War I. Do you understand, children, how Russia was losing economy, soldiers, and civilians? Due to the diversion of food to the war, there was a severe scarcity of food in the cities. On March 8, 1917, around 10,000 women from St. Petersburg took out a procession demanding peace and bread. Most of the workers joined them in this protest. Tsar Nicholas II felt nervous and lost confidence. He ordered the army to suppress the demonstrators even by firing at them. In just 2 days, the situation went so much out of hand that the Tsar abdicated or gave up. It was published in the newspaper The New York Herald. The Russians made a provisional government. This was the first Russian Revolution of 1917 and it was called the March Revolution. After this March Revolution, a bigger revolution broke out in October 1917 and it was not spontaneous. The liberals and aristocrats decided to continue the war to preserve the honor of the fatherland. After the abdication of the war, the common people did not want the war as they were fatigued by military reverses and upset at economic shortages. Common people were organizing themselves in councils which were known as Soviets. These Soviets consisted of soldiers, industrial workers, and people in rural areas. Soviets were channelized by a group of Russian Communist Party called Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were led by Vladimir Lenin. As Bolsheviks took up the demand for unconditional peace, nationalization of all land and redistribution to the peasants, and control over prices and nationalization of all factories and banks. The Soviets seized power from the provisional government in October and November 1917 under the Bolshevik leadership. Full peace could not return to Russia as there started a civil war led by white armies of Russian monarchists and anti-communist soldiers with help from Britain, France, the USSR and Japan. The Bolsheviks announced the end of the Russian Empire. However, gradually most of the former empire's nations agreed to join the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, which was set up in 1924 by the Soviet government of Russia. The USSR tried to build a society that was industrialized and modern and yet did not have inequality of people on the basis of birth, gender, language, etc. Let us watch a video to have a clear idea about Russian Revolution.
The Russian Revolution is a political, social and economic movement that broke out in 1917 in the Russian Empire. This episode is considered to be one of the greatest events of the contemporary era due to the transcendental consequences derived from it. The consequence was the collapse of the Tsar's dynasty, heirs of the Roman emperors, which meant the abolition of the absolutist and despotic system that prevailed until then. The revolution resulted in a communist-led government led by Vladimir Lenin. The causes that motivated the Russian Revolution were: the first cause, Russia was at war with Germany. It was the First World War, what was then called the Great War. The constant defeat suffered by the Russian armies in the war and the many casualties led to discredit the Romanov, the last Tsarist dynasty, with Nicholas II as its head of state. Years before, in 1905, a first revolution took place after the Russian defeat against Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. The second cause, Russia was suffering an acute economic crisis with shortages of food, the population suffering from a terrible famine. It was an eminently rural and backward country. The social organization of Russia was based on the most absolute inequality, differentiating two well-defined social classes: the nobility and the common people, almost all peasants. There was practically no middle class. The third cause can be found in the wife of Tsar Nicholas II. Empress Alexandra, of German origin, was tremendously unpopular and enemy of any reform favorable to the people. A year earlier, they had murdered Rasputin, doctor and advisor to the Empress. These causes, together with a very hard winter, triggered the revolution. We're going to differentiate two phases within the revolution in the year 1917, the February Revolution and the October Revolution, which actually took place in March and November, since Russia was governed by the Julian calendar instead of the Gregorian calendar like the rest of the world. The February Revolution began with a spontaneous strike by workers in the factories of the capital, Petrograd, today St. Petersburg. The following days witnessed strikes and demonstrations throughout Petrograd, and the tension worsened. The demonstrations became increasingly larger. The army didn't have the means to suppress the revolution, and Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, had to abdicate. The first episode of the revolution resulted in over 100 victims, mainly demonstrators. The rapid and unexpected fall of the regime gave rise to a wave of enthusiasm and a feeling of liberation in the country. A provisional government quickly succeeded to absolute power. This government would end up being headed by Alexander Kerensky. These first weeks, full of hope and generosity, were very peaceful, both in the cities and in the rural areas. There were no reprisals against the former servants of the Tsar. Freedom of the press and meetings were decreed, and political exiles were allowed back in, among them the revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, who lived in exile. Things began to move. The Soviets, who were popular assemblies of workers, soldiers and peasants, initially allowed the provisional government to govern, but insisted on a prerogative to influence the government and control various militias. The mass of workers and peasants was politicized. The small Bolshevik party led by Lenin, that imposed a strategic radicalization, became spokesman for the growing general discontent and became the repository of popular aspirations. With his great skills of oratory, he began to defend the postulates of Karl Marx to replace capitalism with a new socio-economic socialist system and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. A frenzy to talk and put forward ideas became established in society. The government of Kerensky was increasingly unpopular. Unable to make reforms, he distanced himself from the population. They continued sending troops to fight in the First World War. This triggered popular revolts. The provisional government opted for repression and began to persecute the opponents. Lenin and Leon Trotsky planned the overthrow of the provisional government to install the communist system. If the February Revolution was a spontaneous uprising, in the October Revolution one could speak of a strategic coup organized by Trotsky and Lenin against the provisional government. In the October Revolution in Petrograd, the Soviets seized the strategic points of the capital and assaulted the Winter Palace by overthrowing the provisional government. Lenin announced three measures: an immediate peace, a decree on land to distribute it among the peasants, and the formation of the Soviet of People's Commissaries, or Sovnarkom, that would organize elections to elect a constituent assembly. Lenin's Bolshevik party was defeated in the elections. Lenin ordered the dissolution of the assembly, democratically elected as a minority. This would lead to a civil war. The Bolsheviks created the Cheka, an organization of political and military intelligence to crush any kind of dissent. Their methods of repression weren't limited to mass arrests and executions, but also used brutal methods of torture. The first concentration camps appeared. The Red Terror had begun. In 1918, the former Russian Tsar Nicholas II, the Tsarina Alexandra and her 5 children, who were held in a mansion in the Ural Mountains, were massacred by a group of revolutionaries. The civil war that confronted the Red Army of Trotsky against the White Army resulted in the victory of the Red Army. Leninism and the dictatorship of the proletariat had been established. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed in 1922. The country was deeply affected. A terrible famine killed over 5 million people. A series of reforms were launched. The party is run vertically from top to bottom. The new state consists of a pyramid of Soviets where the party de facto decides and the Soviets vote what the party has said. In 1922, a sick Lenin leaves his post. A dispute arises over the succession between Trotsky, the creator of the Red Army, and the most brilliant head of the party and other ringleaders. In 1924, Lenin dies.
Volume 1 ends with the death of Lenin. Let us summarize today's class what we have discussed till now. We discussed Tsarist Russia, Nicholas II administration, March Revolution, and Bolsheviks administration. In the next class, let us discuss the rise of Stalin. Thank you.